And yeah, I'll turn the time over to you, Jansen and Amber.
All right, thanks, Christian. Hello, everyone. As Christian said, I manage historic rehabilitation tax credit programs, and Jansen is our historical architect. I do think that we will hold questions. We decided the end would be great. So if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, raise your hand, but we're pretty much going to wait till the end. Just we have a ton of content for you here today, so we want to make sure that we get through it all within an hour, hopefully. So first of all, some of you may be familiar with the 3-day workshop that APT, the Association for Preservation Technology, and Main Street America put on this summer. It was an intensive deep dive into all things building code and historic buildings, specifically on Main Street. Jansen and I took that. Some of you may have taken it as well, but it was such good information that we wanted to take what we learned from it and pull out just a high level 1 hour kind of overview of his building code and historic buildings, not necessarily just on Main Street, but in general. We know that a lot of people, building owners, government officials, are aware that code is a thing. Building code exists, and a lot of people view it as just some scary, nebulous thing that has to happen, but it's relatively overwhelming and misunderstood. So we wanted to do an overview of what code is, what options are out there, and help enable property owners to be able to ask better questions of their code officials and their design professionals. We also wanted to enable government officials and people helping shepherd people through the process to know what all of the options are, because oftentimes that's not necessarily the case. And we also wanted to do somewhat of a review, but also introduce design professionals to options that they may not have known existed. So we definitely have seen over the years projects on historic buildings that perhaps a building owner is presented with one solution to meeting building code, but it's not always the best solution for the historic building. It doesn't always meet the requirements for our tax credit programs or for our grant programs. And a lot of building owners and maybe even government officials don't know that there are other options. So we really just want to drive home the point that you can ask questions, you can ask for alternative solutions. We want to enable people to know at least enough to be able to ask the right questions. So that's our goal here today. First, we're going to do an overview of what codes are even out there, kind of some compliance paths we can take, and then look more specifically at a case study of a building and different paths that you can take for a specific building. And then before that, however, Jansen is going to do a brief introduction to kind of the process and the parties involved when you're looking at code review.
So, hi, I'm Jansen Bennett. I am the I'm the historic architect. So before beginning my work at SHPO, I worked with building code very often. And this is kind of the process that a building owner would go through to get a code compliant project at the end. So as the building owner, you would first come up with a proposed design. Typically, this is a drawing, or sometimes I've seen a verbal description. That's fairly rare. But that design would be required to comply with code. And code in general is actually broken out into a series of codes. So I'll be starting at the top. There's the International Building Code, which looks primarily at new construction. The code below it in orange, the IEBC, is the International Existing Building Code, and that applies for all existing buildings. The International Residential Code, the IRC, looks at only buildings that, at buildings that only have residences. So as soon as you have a mixed use building, it is no longer applicable. The IECC is the International Energy Conservation Code, and it's usually referred to as just Energy Code. Looks at making sure that our buildings are sustainable and kind of sets a very baseline level of requirements for energy conservation. The International Fire Code looks at fire safety And below that is ANSI A117, and that is the accessibility code. So usually in the United States, we'll hear accessibility referred to as ADA. Those are actually two separate, like ADA is legislation, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it has very specific requirements, especially for government and public buildings. ANSI looks at just kind of accessibility in general, and it is a code. And so that's what the code officials will be looking at as opposed to the ADA. So as an owner, once you have a proposed design, which ideally complies with the applicable codes, you would submit that to your AHJ. So that's an authority having jurisdiction. Typically, that is the code official. In some specific instances, it can be another party. Universities often have a separate authority having jurisdiction just because of the way laws are set up around that. And the AHJ is the person who can tell you and give you approval that your building is code compliant and that the proposed design can move forward. Although you will typically interface with the code official, once you submit the drawings or your documentation of the proposed design, they will give it to a whole host of other people, including the fire marshal, the zoning department, the utilities department, the planning department, all of whom will kind of look at their applicable parts and give approval. And then once all of that happens, you can carry on and have a successful project. So as a building owner, that can be really intimidating. And so on the next slide, if you choose to hire a design professional, such as an architect, it's kind of nice because the architect will handle all of that for you. They'll make sure that the proposed design is code compliant. They'll submit it to the authority having jurisdiction. There's typically some back and forth, and then you as the owner are less involved and have to worry about a lot less and be less familiar with code. So that is one kind of positive thing about hiring an architect or another design professional, is that what costs more, you have to worry about a lot less. So that's just kind of a very brief overview of kind of who's involved in code review, as well as the process that a building owner would go through to get a code compliant building.
Okay, so whether you choose to hire an architect or not, like we said, the goal today is for you to be able to ask questions. If you do have an architect, it's still good to be able to realize that maybe the solutions that they're presenting to you aren't the only option. So we're going to look at what the options are. So first, there are 3 model codes. Any construction project, any building construction project has to go through one of these codes. And so the International Code Council, who's kind of the overseeing body of all things code, they require a design professional to choose a code path, but a design professional can be the owner. So it's just the design professional or the owner is the one who gets to choose which path you go down. And in addition to what Jansen talked about with code being a benefit of hiring an architect, sometimes if you have a larger scale of a project, you're going to have to be required to have stamped drawings by a licensed professional anyways, but that only happens after a certain level of work. So if you are an owner doing a project, you get to choose the path to some things. So these are the 3 model codes. Jansen already kind of mentioned these. IRC is for residential, IBC is for all, it can be applied to any building that doesn't fall under the IRC requirements. And then IEBC is International Existing Building Code, and that can be used for any existing building regardless of the occupancy. The IRC can often be the least stringent. It can come with the least requirements, but it is only limited to buildings that are 3 stories max and only have 1 to 2 family units within it. The IRC does have an optional Appendix J, which would provide additional flexibility for historic or existing buildings. They have a rehabilitation section, but we're pretty sure that none, or maybe a few, but probably none of the municipalities in Utah have adopted Appendix J. So it's good to know that it exists and that it could potentially be adopted, but currently it most likely isn't in your jurisdiction. The IBC is the most well-known, used for all types of buildings, but it is going to be the most stringent. It's going to require the most change if you are using it on an existing or an historic building. It doesn't have any provisions for keeping historic features within a building. And then the IEBC is an international existing building code that can be used for, like I said, a building of any type of occupancy, and it does contain a bunch of provisions for historic buildings. So we're going to dive more deeply into the IEBC. So once we get into the existing building code, we have 3 more options. First, it's important to note that all of the codes are updated on a regular basis. The IEBC is updated every 3 years, but your local jurisdiction has to adopt the new version. So even if we have a 2021 IEBC, a lot of places are still using the 2018 because that's the only one they've adopted. So it's important to know which version you were actually obligated to use. And then within IEBC, regardless of which of the 3 paths you choose, Chapter 3 does have some higher level code requirements that apply to all buildings, regardless of the path you choose. But then the paths themselves are the prescriptive method outlined in Chapter 5, the work area method outlined in Chapters 6 through 12, and the performance method outlined in Chapter 13, which is essentially what this excerpt says, with the addition that throughout, for the most part, repairs can pretty much always be done, well, not always, but most of the time be done in kind. So if you are just doing a simple repair, you can do it in the way that it was done historically with the materials that were used historically. So jumping into the first of the methods, prescriptive method that's outlined in Chapter 5. This is the most traditional. It's most like the IBC. So it's going to have the most requirements for a historic or an existing building to be brought up to code. It does have that provision in there for repairs being done in kind, but the AHJ, the code official, can use their discretion on that. And if they feel that a repair needs to be done in a different way because it constitutes a distinct life safety hazard, doesn't actually define, but if they think that it constitutes that, then they can require you to meet code even for repairs. And then also at the bottom here, the prescriptive method requires an entire building to meet the full IFC fire code. So if a historic building doesn't already meet fire code in full, then the prescriptive method is going to likely require a lot of upgrades when it comes to fire safety. The pros and cons of the prescriptive method: it is more flexible than the standard IBC used for all construction. It does have the repair clause, but again, that can be reversed if the AHJ feels necessary. The cons are that you have to completely meet fire code, which is going to mean a lot more to your budget, most likely. Change of occupancy, we'll talk more about what that actually means in a little bit, but change of occupancy, if that happens, you are basically kicked entirely back to the IBC. So if you have a change of occupancy, you are just doing IBC, which is more restrictive. And then the prescriptive method applies to the whole building, not just the area that you're working on, and which is different than the second method. So the work area method in Chapters 6 through 12 is definitely more flexible than prescriptive, and it's triggered. The amount of code you have to meet under the work area method is triggered by the scale of your project. So again, we have the repair clause. Pretty much always, if you're doing a repair, you can do it how it was done before. But then once we get above that, we have alteration levels 1, 2, and 3. And so we have to figure out what level your project falls under. Level 1 is just a step above repair: removal, replacement, covering of existing materials or elements serving the same purpose. So you're not changing the use of the materials, you're not changing the use, you're not reconfiguring spaces, but level 1 requires you to meet code in Chapter 7, the code that's outlined in Chapter 7 and Chapter 3, because like I said, that applies to everything. But Chapter 7 alone, which is going to be a lot less than IBC or the prescriptive method. Level 2, that's when you start to work a little bit more on the building. You're reconfiguring spaces, you're maybe adding doors and windows, you're extending HVAC and plumbing into other areas of the building, but the work area is still less than 50% of the square footage of the building. that's when you just have to follow the requirements in outlined in level 2. So for that, it would be chapters 3, chapter 7, and chapter 8, because the levels are cumulative. The further you go up, you just have to add on to the last one. So level 3 is when you are doing a lot more work and it's up throughout the building. So more than 50% of the square footage. Level 3, again, is going to be the closer option to IBC, which is going to have more requirements. You have to follow chapters 3, chapter 7, chapter 8, and chapter 9, which has an extensive level of code requirements. Sometimes under the work area method, the AHJ will require you to put together a report demonstrating that you're still meeting the intent of the code by following all of these different requirements. So to give you an example of how the different alteration levels can be applied, looking specifically at means of egress, so there's sections for a lot of different types of alterations that you might be making, or different work and safety requirements that there might be, but looking specifically at means of egress, the alteration level 1, if that's where your project lies in alteration level 1, you only have to be maintaining the existing egress. You don't have to add any more, you don't have to upgrade it, you can maintain exactly what's there. If you are at a level 2, you have to update the egress as per the requirements in chapter 8 within the work area, sometimes within the whole floor, but not the whole building. And then if you are a level 3, you essentially, it's the requirements outlined in section 805, includes everything before it, but it's the whole building. So you're having to do a lot more work if you are at a chapter or a level 3 when it comes to upgrading your means of egress. Okay, so we mentioned change of use, change of occupancy. There's a lot of different terms that can be thrown around. We won't get super in depth into that, but in the work area method, if we have a change of occupancy to a higher hazard level, that's going to come with more code requirements. And so looking more just at uses, this table shows different uses that a building can have, as well as the groups that those are put into. So a studio and a bowling alley would all be considered assembly, but they may be a different level within the grouping system. So anyways, I don't need to get too deep into that, but the way that we use this is in the code, there are different tables of hazard categories for different hazards. So this is another example of egress, but there's a different table for fire safety and other different types of hazards. So in this situation, in the lower right-hand corner, you see that so institutional buildings are going to be considered a higher hazard when it comes to egress than any of the residential options are. Those are considered 3 and 4. So I is 2, residential is 3 and 4, specifically when it comes to egress. So if you are changing the use from a lower one to a higher one on the hazard table, you have to follow the higher hazard requirements, which are outlined on the left here. It essentially says you have to meet egress requirements outlined in IBC, the International Building Code, which is the strictest one. But then again, there are exceptions. There's always exceptions, it always depends. But so again, it's going to be less requirements in the IBC, but it's going to be a lot more requirements than if you didn't change the use, or if you change the use within the same hazard category or to a lower hazard category. And that's what's mentioned on the right-hand side. So basically, if you do that, if you're within the same or you're lower, you don't have to do a lot of upgrades. You just have to follow what's outlined in 905, section 905, unless you're rebuilding the egress. If that's the case, you're kicked back to the IBC with the one exception written here. Don't expect you to read it all, just know that it's there. And then the work area method also has chapter 12, which has essentially just several historic building specific exceptions. They don't necessarily say it that way, but so again, we have the repair clause, which is found throughout, but then so doorway, corridor, and stairway widths at the discretion again of the AHJ can be narrower, which is maybe not something that people know. Transoms can be kept between corridors and units or offices, things like that, as long as they're fixed in place and they're sprinkled. I won't read through all of them, but you get the idea. There's different exceptions for different historic features within a historic building that can be identified in some way as historic. And I think the language here says that the agency with such authority can be located at the state or local government level or through the AIA. So if somebody says it's historic, you can follow these requirements or exceptions. The pros and cons for the work area method, it is more flexible than the prescriptive method. It's definitely more flexible than the IBC. There's lots of exceptions and provisions for historic buildings and features, and it almost always, but not always, only applies to the area that you're working on. So you can scale out your work in order to determine how much code you're going to have to meet. And then the biggest con is likely just the change of occupancy situation, where if you are moving up in hazard level, it'll kick you back to the IBC. Not entirely, but quite a bit. And then lastly, we have the performance method. So this is a scoring system. Jansen will definitely get more into what this looks like, but essentially there are 3 categories: fire, safety, means of egress, and general safety, that have to be given a score based on the existing building has to be evaluated to see what its score in each area is, and the proposed project has to see how it would make the building score in each of these 3 areas. And the reason that we have to evaluate the existing in addition to the proposed is that you're not allowed to make the building less safe than it was. So say you had a really high score in fire safety, you're not allowed to do anything below that moving forward, but there are minimum requirements also put forth by the code for each of these categories. So it's the higher of previous performance or existing performance and these minimums. The higher of all of these is what you have to meet. A licensed professional does have to be the one to calculate them, so that can be a limitation potentially. However, it is often considered to be the most flexible of the methods, just depending on your situation. The licensed professional is going to have to put together the score summary after they figure it out and a structural analysis report to the building code official for review. If you're going to pursue this method, it's best to be in contact with the code official early and often, just to make sure that you're on the same page. Here's a table of that scoring system. And so we don't have a specific clause on change of occupancy or anything like that, because the scores are based off of the occupancy. You can see that on the left-hand side. So B would be business. You have to score a minimum of 30 under fire safety. Unless it's scored higher before, then that would be your minimum. 40 under means of egress, 40 under general safety. Whereas R is residential, but they have lower requirements: 21 under fire safety, 38 under egress, and 38 under general safety. So again, pros, it is usually the most flexible. It usually allows you to do less work. That's a generalization, but allows you to do less work than the other methods. It really depends on your project. And it's simpler in that you only have to look at about 20 code requirements outside of chapter 3, which applies to everything, but only about 20 as opposed to dozens in any of the other methods or an IBC. A con is that it could potentially be more work for a design professional to calculate and summarize, but it just really depends on the complexity of your project. And then the fact that you legally have to have a design professional could potentially be a con as well. And now Jansen is going to talk about a hypothetical case study of a building that does exist, but not necessarily what they did and the issues they faced. And
Thanks, Amber.
Out of my, were you able to share?
I was, I believe. So, like Amber said, I'm going to walk you through a case study, and this case study was based off of the Union Block building at 57 South Main Street in Brigham City. And so, again, this is a case study very loosely based off of the existing building with kind of arbitrary goals and an arbitrary project in mind. So in its existing condition, it is a retail store with a mezzanine level in the back and a combination of office space and residential dwelling units on the upper floor. A few unique things to kind of think of before I dive into the plans is everything on the second level is accessed through a door in the adjacent building. which is not too uncommon on historic main streets, but in some instances it can kind of cause a few tricky situations as you're going through code review, depending on kind of how everything is parceled out, whether there's an easement, there are lots of things to kind of be aware of. So you should talk with your code official if you're looking at a project where that's the case. Getting into the floor plans. So on the ground floor, there is the existing storefront system, a large open sales floor, existing restrooms with storage, changing rooms, more storage, and a stairway going up to the mezzanine level. Also, the second form of egress is right back here. On the mezzanine level, with the sales floor below, there's additional sales floor space here, a changing room, a restroom, and a mechanical and furnace area. And then on the upper floor, which only takes up a small portion, like it's smaller toward the front than the floors below, it has business and office space in the front, 4 residential units in the back, and it has mixed occupancy. So type B in the front, type R in the back, as you can see here. So 4 residential units, 4 office spaces, all accessed from one staircase. So the project goals that we'll be looking at is on the ground level, updating the entry and storefront system and converting the existing restrooms into accessible restrooms. So that's meeting all of the requirements set forth in the ANSI 117. On the mezzanine level, adding a second changing room and converting the restroom again into an accessible restroom. On the second level, converting the 4 office areas into 2 one-bedroom residential dwelling units and converting the 4 existing one-bedroom dwelling units into 2 two-bedroom units. So that will be kind of the overarching goal and the work we want to do as opposed to the work required by code. So we're going to start with the prescriptive compliance method, just because in setting it up, not only does the code kind of list prescriptive, then work area, then performance, but also goes from kind of more restrictive to less restrictive. So you'll be able to see kind of how the work changes as we go through. So with the prescriptive method, at the very beginning, it says that alterations to any building or structure shall comply with the requirements of the International Building Code, that's the IBC, for new construction. So essentially you are bringing an existing building up to new construction standards. That's what the prescriptive method sets out to do. It will then go through a few exceptions, but that's kind of the overarching goal. However, where an automatic sprinkler system has been installed in accordance with the IBC, and that sprinkler system goes throughout the entirety of the building, you can look at the fire resistance ratings of building elements and materials of the current building code. And so when you're looking and reading through code, the current building code is the code that was in place at the time the building was built. So essentially this exception says that if you have an automatic sprinkler system throughout the entire building, you don't have to look at improving the fire resistance ratings of what's there. So the required changes that we had to make, you can see kind of the changes we wanted to make. So changes to the storefront system, changes to the restroom, but we had to add an automatic sprinkler system throughout. We had to add a second egress stair right here that goes up to the residential level. The prescriptive method also outlines a number of seismic stabilization efforts that you need to undertake. So in this case, we had to adhere all of the floor and ceiling and roof assemblies into the load-bearing walls on the perimeter. And then another kind of big undertaking is that you have to bring all the major systems. So that's your heating and cooling, plumbing, electrical, etc. all need to be brought into compliance with the adopted IBC. So that usually requires a lot of work and it's fairly extensive. So we had to do all of that. We had to do those same things on the mezzanine level. And so we've added the second changing room. We've removed a wall to make this restroom accessible, but we have also added an automatic sprinkler system. You can see the impact of that second egress stair, as well as, the seismic stabilization on this level as well, and upgrades to all of the systems. On the residential floor, we have again added the automatic sprinkler system. There's that second egress stair, which makes this unit slightly smaller. We have done the seismic stabilization, systems upgrades, but we've also been required to add smoke and carbon monoxide detectors in each sleeping unit. So that's each bedroom, and each dwelling unit. So that's the living space of each apartment. So those are just kind of an example of what would be required to undertake this project on under the prescriptive method. Moving on to the work area compliance method. The way you begin with the work area compliance method, or the way that you typically begin, is you kind of draw out your desired changes and calculate the work area. So here we've updated the storefront system, we've done work in the restrooms, and that's a whole of 869 square feet of this 6581 square feet on the floor, and that's 13% of the floor area. On the mezzanine level, because the work is so small, it is only 6% of the floor area. However, on the residential floor, where we've made quite a few changes, it's 51%. And while we're here, I want to note kind of the way the code specifies that you calculate the work area. So we've altered and reconfigured the walls in these spaces, but not in any of the bedrooms back here and the bedroom/living spaces here. So because we haven't moved the walls, we only need to include the area where like a contractor or the person doing the work would have to occupy to perform other alterations. So because we've removed a door and walls here and here, you include that small portion of the larger space as your work area. So with all of that, it equals just over 1,800 square feet out of the approximately 3,500 square feet, which gives us 51% of the floor area. So one interesting thing to note is that in the work area method, there are some requirements which you have to undertake when the floor area or the work area exceeds 50% of the floor area. So because we're doing more than 50% of the area on this floor, we'll have to do some additional requirements. Now, one way that is often employed by architects is to phase out the project. And so say you wanted to do all of the, like do the conversion of the office space into the residential space and submit that to your code official as one project, wait until that project is complete, and then submit a second project looking at the back units, then you would be looking at 25% or 30% of the floor area, and you would not have to do as much work. Just a little tip or trick. You can think about how you feel about that ethically and morally, but it is totally legal. So looking to final kind of round out our calculation of the work area, you add up all of the work areas from each individual floor and divide it by the total building area, and we are doing 23% of the building area. And then we can look at where that lands us as far as alterations are concerned. So we're reconfiguring spaces and doing more than just removing and replacing what is existing. So that bumps us up to a level 2, but we're doing less than 50% of the building area. So we aren't bumped up to level 3. We get to stick with level 2 with our reconfiguration of the spaces. So the work that was required, So kind of the way Amber was saying, when we look at level 2, we get to look at chapter 8 and look at kind of what's required in chapter 8, but also we need to comply with the requirements of chapter 7. So the work area is cumulative. As you kind of bump up a level, you have to do the work outlined in that level as well as the levels below. So we'll have to meet the requirements of chapter 8 and chapter 7. And because we're doing so little on the mezzanine level, it essentially just requires that all new materials, systems, and equipment meet the code requirements. So everything, when we're doing new materials, all those have to meet the requirements of IBC. And honestly, it's kind of hard to get a like storefront system or a plumbing fixture that doesn't meet the requirements of IBC. So you're usually okay. That's the same on the second or on the mezzanine level. Because we're touching so little of the work area, we don't have to touch any of the other spaces. We just need to make sure that the studs, the drywall, the paint we're using all meet the code requirements. However, on the residential floor, we need to make sure that everything we use, all new materials and equipment, meet their code requirements. But because we're over 50% of the floor area, we need to make sure that we install an automatic sprinkler system on the second level. And we're also required to install smoke, fire, and carbon monoxide detection systems. And we need to ensure that this egress stair is smoke tight. So that means like making sure that there aren't any gaps, including in windows and doors. I think that you would probably have to replace the door, and it wouldn't hurt if you're replacing it to make it a fire door. That means fire rated, like just for safety. You wouldn't be required to, but I'd recommend it. So that is kind of the work that would be required under the work area method. It is interesting that we're able to keep the existing stair, even though it wouldn't meet, it's too steep. It has too much rise for too little run. And also it is missing a landing, as would be required by the current IBC. But because it was compliant with the requirements of the building code when it was constructed, and as long as the code official doesn't think it kind of poses a distinct hazard to life, you would be able to keep it. Also, in Chapter 8, it outlines, this is Chapter 8 of the IBC, just so you know. I'll double check that. It is definitely Chapter 8 of the IEBC. I apologize. Chapter 10 of the IBC looks at egress. But in the IEBC, for single exit buildings, you can be permitted to have a single exit as opposed to a second egress if any of the following conditions work. So if you have an R2 occupancy with fewer than 4 dwelling units and the maximum travel from the unit to the exit stair is less than 50 feet, you're fine. We meet that requirement. Also, you will need to look at the dwelling unit itself. So in this case, our dwelling unit may have an occupant load greater than 10, but we would meet the travel distance not exceeding 75 feet. But we definitely meet the requirement that we are not more than 3 stories in height and that the exit access travel distance from the door to any habitable room is less than 50 feet. So we're okay with our dwelling units. And the last one is we're in R2 occupancy. We have 4 or fewer dwelling units per floor, and our exit stair is in a smoke-proof enclosure. So also the dwelling unit entrance to the exit stair was less than 20 feet, so we're okay. So in any of those, if any one of those conditions is met, you don't have to get a second egress stair as long as the code official or AHJ signs off on it. We want to kind of, Amber touched on this, that you'll want to look at kind of where you're going. So in this case, we're going from business to R2, which means that we did bump up a level, but because we are doing the automatic sprinklers and making sure that the exit stair is a fireproof enclosure, we're okay. Just as an aside, as a little information, the having a double wide masonry enclosure is usually seen as a 4-hour fire rating. So because we have our stair is enclosed in double wide masonry, we have that 4-hour fire rating. However, if you were going to a lower hazard, then you would be able to keep the existing elements regardless or almost regardless of what the building code said. Because the requirement that it states that you need to meet is that you may have to install a standpipe. And that is only applicable if your building is 4 or more stories, if your highest story is more than 30 feet above the ground, or if the floor level of the lowest story is lower than 30 feet below the ground, below the highest level. So because we don't meet any of that, it's just good to know. So moving on to the performance compliance method. This is the most flexible. So you start by doing a preliminary evaluation of the existing conditions. So you look at each of the 20 safety parameters, and each of these safety parameters will direct you to a code requirement in the IBC. And then you evaluate your building based on whether or not it complies with that requirement in the IBC, and it will tell you how many points to add or subtract in each category. So as Amber mentioned, the existing building is evaluated to provide a baseline score. And then once you've done the proposed design, you evaluate it. And you need to make sure that your proposed design has a score higher than your baseline score or equal to, and also higher than the code-established minimum scores. So in this instance, I went through, calculated our existing conditions, and we have a building score of 6.83, or fire safety score of 6.83, a means of egress score of 18.08, and a general safety score of 11.58. And that is well below any of the kind of code established minimums for our occupancy. So that means that we need to focus our proposed design on meeting the minimum scores as opposed to the baseline scores. Another thing to note about the mixed occupancies. So in the performance method, you need to calculate the scores for each occupancy. And then unless you meet some very specific fire separation requirements, you go with whichever one is considered least safe or the lowest score. So I'll walk through kind of the proposed changes that I made to bring the building into compliance. And our goal here will be, because the proposed design doesn't have business, we'll want to meet the mercantile requirements. So even though we have business, or sorry, we have residential and mercantile uses, the mercantile has a higher rating or a higher minimum required level. So we'll want to get a fire safety score of 23, a means of egress score of 40, and a general safety score of 40. And I'm not sure how other design professionals would kind of approach this, but from my standpoint, it makes sense to kind of get the highest score with the least amount of extra work done. So I'll walk you through what changes I made and how that affected the score. So on the ground floor, I added smoke and fire detection systems, which, in addition to being relatively easy to install, also have the least amount of impact on the historic fabric. I did the same on the mezzanine level, and then focused primarily on the residential floor to kind of make up the most in our scores. So I added a smoke and fire detection system. Also, I added a mini split HVAC system throughout this level, which means that we definitely have separate heating and cooling and ventilation systems between the mezzanine level and the residential level. I increased the fire ratings. So that meant adding more drywall to the walls at the corridors, and then the walls between the units. I also retrofitted proposed retrofitting the corridor doors to provide a fire rating, and put an automatic sprinkler system throughout this level. And then moved into evaluating the points. So I'm going to show you kind of where each of those changes made a difference. So here we were at a category A, which essentially had no fire partitions between the tenant and dwelling units. So that means essentially if a fire started in one apartment, it could spread really easily to the other apartments. So the work that I did at the corridor and the party walls brought us up to a 0. So we don't gain points toward the score, but we aren't being damaged by the lack of fire protection. So that is, I brought those up into a 1 hour fire rating at the walls, and made sure that floor assemblies would be rated 1 for more than 1 hour, but less than 2 hours. So the existing ceilings are a tin ceiling, and I'm assuming that there is some lath and plaster below that. You could find that out by drilling a hole in a very discrete spot of the tin ceiling and verifying that. But that is the case in between 50 and 65% of tin ceilings. So I figured it would be worth getting that. So again, that brought us from a -4 in each of the categories to a 0 in each of the categories. It's similar for the corridor walls. Here we're looking at a -7 for no fire partitions, and then a 0 for 1 hour to less than 2 hour fire resistance rating. So again, that's like not hurting us, but sorry, it's not helping us. We aren't getting 2 additional points, but it's no longer hurting us. So again, from -7 up to a 0. For HVAC systems, so we went from 0 points for one system that was code compliant, but was kind of over the entire building. The mini splits that we added made it so that our systems serve no more than 1 story. And the mezzanine level in this case counts as part of the ground floor because it's all open to the same air essentially. So there, that improvement did gain us 5 points. For the automatic fire detection, we went from a category C with smoke detectors only in the HVAC system throughout the building to smoke detectors installed throughout the floor area for an additional 6 points. So from 0 up to 6. And then here, because we added automatic fire detection, we went from the kind of manual fire alarm boxes where you pull to ring a fire alarm. We went to code compliant fire alarm systems, and that got us 5 additional points. But note that because mercantile, we would have had 5 points and would have increased that to 10 points. But because residential is lower, we went from -5 points to 0 points. So it's not improving it's not like adding points to our score, but it's no longer hurting us. So -5 to 0. And then for the dead ends, we went from a category A with a dead end of 35 feet in non-sprinklered buildings to a dead end of 50 feet in, so even though we're not group B, sorry, I'm going to begin again on this point. So in category B, the IEBC references specifically group B. However, if you look at the section, it refers to, in the IBC, it also includes category R and a few others. So for this 2 points, I would make an argument with the code official that our category R should be included in category B since we have sprinklered the building and are meeting all of the other requirements in this section with the exception. The code official may or may not go for that argument. And if he didn't, or he or she didn't, we would lose out on kind of those 2 points, but it would not kind of make or break. It seemed like an easy thing to argue for. So with our dead end of 50 feet or less with sprinklers, I would say we would get into a category B.
Hey, Jansen, we only have about another minute if you want to.
Oh, I am sorry. So I'll skip through the next few. So in the end, with those modifications, very few to the mercantile space, quite a few on the residential area, we got up to 43.83, 49.58, and 50.38. And so those changes got us up to meeting the minimum requirements throughout the building. A quick comparison of the methods. So all of the different compliance methods require approval from the AHJ. They all reference the IBC and some of its requirements. The prescriptive and performance method look at the entire building as opposed to just specific areas of the building. Oh, sorry. I skipped a line. Similarly, the prescriptive and performance also require you to meet the IBC requirements for new construction, as opposed to a separate set of requirements. Similarly, the prescriptive and the work area require you to meet all listed requirements, whereas with the performance method, you can kind of pick and choose which requirements you meet and which you don't comply with. They also impose additional requirements for changes of occupancy, whereas the performance, it's just kind of in the way you score things. And the prescriptive and work area both provide specific exceptions for historic buildings, but the performance method does not. So that's a little bit kind of brief overview, and we are happy to address any questions if you have time to stick around for a moment.
Jansen. Looks like we have one question. Will you be emailing and recording to the participants? Yes, so it is recorded. We're going to put it on our YouTube. I think we can share the slides and the recording once we have it up, to as long as we can get that list. I'm pretty sure we can. So yes, definitely. Are there any other? I have a couple of questions if nobody else does, but please feel free to jump in, raise your hand. I know we're past the hour, but we're happy to answer anything. I know it's a lot of information. Okay, so Jansen, I'm sorry to put you on the spot. I should have brought this up. But how does accessibility, I know that there's a concern with adding residential. Well, I guess because there already was residential, maybe that's it. Residential to upper floors on Main Street buildings. Is accessibility an issue when you do that? Does it depend on the number of units you have?
Yeah, so it depends. All right, so again, with the code, the way code is set up, the code requirements are legal, not necessarily ethical or moral. So should you provide like accessible means of egress for your second-story residential dwelling units? Ethically and morally, probably you should, but you are not required to unless building code says you need to. So because in kind of the case study example, we were only looking at 4 units. Some accessibility requirements are triggered when you have 5 or more. Some are triggered when you have 10 or more, and some are triggered when you have 20 or more. So that is kind of how that all works. And again, also varies depending on which compliance method you choose to go with. The prescriptive compliance method essentially says that you need to make it as accessible as a building with new construction. And the IBC says that if you have 4 or fewer residential units, you don't need to provide like an elevator or a lift. So that's why in the prescriptive method, we had the second egress stair, but we didn't have to like add an elevator.
Awesome, thanks. It looks like Christian submitted a question. When should you get a code official involved in your house project?
That is an excellent question. Another kind of trick of the trade with architects is we get a code official on very, very early. So as soon as we have an idea of what work is going to be done, we draw it up, look briefly at the code requirements, make sure that we aren't making any big errors, and then we contact the code official and say, I'm looking at a project. This is what I'm proposing to do. We'd love to have you take a look and see if we're within the right, if we're coloring within the lines. so to speak. One thing to note with that approach is that the only time a code official or another authority having jurisdiction can give you approval is after you've gone through the whole step of submitting something for their review and them saying, yes, you can proceed with construction. But you can have as many of these informal talks as your code official is willing to have. It is very helpful because so the way code is written, the authority having jurisdiction is the final say, and code can be interpreted many different ways. And so it helps to kind of have those informal, not not like approval related conversations early on, just so that when you get to a point where you are submitting, you can be fairly confident that what you've submitted is going to be okay with the code official.
Awesome. I also wanted to touch on, there's a perception, at least in what we've heard, I think, that the performance method is more work for the owner or the design professional to figure out and calculate. But would you touch on how you felt about that?
Sure. So I agree that there's that perception. And if I'm completely honest, when I was kind of a practicing architect in the private sector, the only compliance method I ever worked with was the work area compliance method, because it provides a good balance of leniency with historic and existing buildings without, while still being like incredibly familiar and incredibly similar to the code requirements of the IBC. So I hadn't ever done the performance compliance method or kind of dived into it before kind of becoming a member of the SHPO staff and hearing about it. But from what I've seen and from what my experience kind of working on different projects and applying it to different projects, it's not more difficult, it's just very different. And so instead of looking and being worried about the entirety of code, you're looking at very specific things. And so depending on the size and scope of the project, for example, with the case study, I would have spent probably 3 or 4 days doing a code analysis of that building if I were a practicing architect, whereas it took me about 2 days or 1 day twice because I made additional changes. But 1 day to do a code analysis with the performance method. So, and I could see that getting even less as someone got more familiar with it. I think it would be just kind of a steep learning curve, and then it would be really easy afterward.
Awesome. If there aren't any other questions, I just wanted to throw in one last thing. We didn't really get into energy code, but we recently discovered Jansen did a deep dive in energy code also for a project, and there is a provision in there as well for a historic building. So
yeah, it is. I don't know. Occasionally you have kind of like a carte blanche provision, and energy code has that, where essentially if the building owner, a state official, a design professional, like if anyone says it's historic and that meeting the energy code would ruin any historic material or damage the historic character in any way, you're exempt from the IEBC. So.
Yep. I just wanted to throw this last slide on here too. There's just a couple of links to the different building codes, the existing building code, and then the APT does have a committee on code where they do education and they are trying to help make changes to code where it could possibly be more flexible for historic buildings. And then there's Jansen's and my contact information. Sorry we went over, but hopefully this information was helpful. Do we have any additional questions for the last minute, or is everyone good? Okay, Christian, did you have anything else to add?
I don't have anything else to add. That was great. Thank you so much. That was very helpful to me personally, and also to my role as the Main Street coordinator. So thank you.
All right, well, thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.